Good morning, you're on Fresh FM. I'm actually talking today from Bluff, and it's it's a beautiful day. Bluff always has very interesting weather. It's either really extreme or it isn't, and it's quite interesting because you don't really sort of tend to think about Bluff as being a place that's sort of up there with the Silicon Valley or the technological developments of the world, but in reality, this sort of port which services Southland, which in turn handles 28% of the GDP, is actually more of a critical part to the developments of the fourth industrial revolution in New Zealand, or globally, in fact, than many other parts of New Zealand. And I'm just going to walk you through some of these places. So, right over there, we've got TY Point, which we all know about, the aluminum smelter. It also makes very specialised equipment used in the space industry and the technological instruments. But at the moment, there is a probability that this will shut down at some stage, and there are major moves to actually turn around and use this for creating hydrogen fuel. This has been marketed as green. Much like the aluminum smelter, however, there is a downside, and that we will find that the connections to the smelter that turn around drop waste on the west coast are the same connections that will be bringing in iron sands from the west coast and other parts of New Zealand, which basically, when processed, are actually quite radioactive, and they're used as a catalyst process for the hydrogen. So not as clean, quite green as they want. Then there comes down the usage of what is it going to be used for? The assumption is that this is going to be used to power the energy for New Zealand. It's going to be great, give us clean, sustainable energy, which we just assume we're going to use ourselves. But if you actually pay very much close attention, what you actually find out is they talk about, there's enough fuel there to basically fuel a rocket every 2 weeks. I think, don't quote me on the figure, that's not important, but the point is, the key word is they made reference to rockets. It gets interesting, we say. But of course, the other thing, you look behind the TY Point, you'll see is the TY Point is the transmission lines, the main transmission line that goes from there up to Manapori. About 3 years ago, from Manapori, you'd be looking at 12 wires coming out of there, which feed other, not just TY Point, but other main lines. And they were running, I think it was about 120 volts. Again, the figures don't matter per se. What's more important is that when I visited 2 years ago, it was 24 wires, so low that it was almost touching the trees. It's been quite interesting. A lot of fires in Central Otago, when you look where they are, it's directly where you've actually got wires hanging over wilding pines. But that's another story, as they say. But it's so touching the ground because it's now had 24 wires, and they are now running voltage at 240. I said the specifics of it aren't important. The point is that it's doubled the capacity, which shows you that they're planning to use a lot of power. So that power obviously feeds into TY Point, which would also be linked into the hydrogen development. But if not, where would be freed up to use electrical cars? Not necessarily. 40% of our electrical systems are actually owned by offshore companies, specifically BlackRock and Vanguard, who actually have become increasingly aggressive in buying up land in both New Zealand and America. They've actually duplicated what the Chinese have done with Belt Road. So the Chinese realised really on that there are much better ways to fight wars. You can fight them with the checkbooks. So they started buying up, basically doing things for people. Say, well, we'll do this to you, but it will just cost you a little bit of your sovereignty, or you'll just have to do this for us. Now the Americans started to get into that game, and they got in there about, give or take, about 2009. Nobody ever actually quite knows where that money comes from. I don't know either, but I sometimes wonder about all of the. Let me put it this way, 9/11 wasn't just a terrorist attack, it was actually as much a financial bank robbery when you start to look at money laundered and all sorts of other things. But that, as they say, is another story. Meanwhile, the point is that this huge investment fund has been matching the Chinese, doing checkbook buy-ups, and that includes Electricity New Zealand. So in those developments, what we're seeing is that they've been buying up that particular land, and what we're also seeing at the same time is a massive push for the development of the space industry within New Zealand. It's effectively that space industry, again, is marketed as clean and green, but when you pull the layer off and you start looking at who owns Rocket Lab, what they're launching, it becomes very clear that they're actually looking at the militarisation of space and pushing newest agendas. Of course, once we get into things like the privatisation of water, we start to look at the increased debts that we've actually borrowed as a result of COVID, we can expect more privatisation. So surely those electrical grids will be, privatisation will be back on the agenda, and so prices will go up and up and up, and not a lot of electricity is going to be used for the average Kiwi, because it's going to be used for industrial purposes such as space industry. So moving right along, What we then turn around and see, so we've got the main wire line, and you move right across there, you'll see right behind that big yellow building, which you can't see if you're listening to me on the radio, of course, right onto the other side of Arawa Bay is little eight golf balls, much like the ones you'd expect to see at Waihopa Place. And if you were up there close, you'd actually see that there's 30 antenna array, and they do all sorts of interesting things, which I've written about beforehand. They're links to the American missile defense technology, research and so on, and space tracking in general. But they've also become the clients for Elon Musk's Starlink. Now, they track the particular Starlink, which is a list of satellites, nanosatellites, which in their full fruition will be up to 40,000 satellites will pass over the sky of New Zealand every year. At the moment, it's about, give or take, about 2,000. When they first came out, people started doing stories about UFOs, and they said, oh no, it's just Elon Musk Starlinks, it'll make the internet go faster, which is kind of interesting because people talk about 5G, but the reality is when you start to talk to transmission and contact people, there actually isn't a lot of 5G places out there other than your major transmission towers, like the ones up on top of, say, above Dunedin, which is, Cordia. 5G's there, but otherwise it's mostly 4G. But that's where the internet thing starts to come into equations. But we're not going to get into that. What we're more interested about is the fact that when you start to look at things like Elon Musk's Starlink, and it's true of Jeff Bezos as well, but when we start to look at Starlink, we realise that those first particular satellites are actually passing over. Again, they're under contract to the Department of Defence. They're being used as basically allowing the Pentagon to piggyback its communications, its targeting systems, and basically expand its entire global reach. So again, when you start to get into things like HARP and the militarisation of our ionosphere, this is what Starlink actually allows them to do, because it is all about propagation. The higher your antenna is actually up there, the more you can boost your signal up there, and the more you can do that, the more power you can, and the more power you can do that, the more your ability to actually tap into the ionosphere and its electromagnetic frequency, which has huge potential, some of which is almost science fiction based. But like I said, as we're progressing faster and faster with the fourth industrial race, this is where we're actually heading. Now, the fourth industrial revolution is the response of it when you look at the geopolitics is quite interesting, but let's take a little bit of a break, and I think since we're on Fresh FM, I think we will go with a classic, David Bowie's Starman, because we're all talking about space and I'd like to come and meet you. And I said, you're on the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen Investigates, live from Bluff. See you shortly. So this is Ben Vidgen reporting back live from Bluff on Deadline, on the Ben Vidgen Investigates Deadline Reports at Fresh FM, and I'm sort of at Bluff, and I've already told you about TY Point and the transmission powers, how they link into things like the development of the space industry with New Zealand, which is incredibly militarised, doesn't really have a lot to do with climate change. Then I swing you on to Elon Musk, and we start to get into things like the fourth industrial revolution. Now, the geopolitics of the fourth industrial revolution is quite straightforward. China has turned around and realised that with the use of AI, it can actually come up with amazing technology which really removes the need for labour. And it removes the need to basically be nice to your working force. Now, of course, if you remove those costs, what you ultimately end up with is the fact that you're actually able to make things cheaper. And if you're able to make things cheaper, you're able to actually sell more of them, and thus you're able to actually outbid your economic partners. Now, America, of course, has been very, very freaked out about this. So their response is to, of course, do exactly what China is. So AI is just like nuclear weapons, and that we are now looking at a new arms race. And if you imagine, you've ever seen this, the Terminator, we start to talk about Skynet, then you start to read up on the ethical and whether, where AI will get to us if it's not regulated and it doesn't have ethics basically put on it. That's where you actually end. And I'm not exaggerating this. Please feel free to go and read some very nice articles from the Guardians or the Washington Post or whatever mainstream source you feel comfortable with that'll actually verify that that's the danger, that is the ultimate end game of AI. So America is basically risking something which is just like we did with the nuclear wars. So afraid of the other side that we create a technology which ultimately puts us at a point where we actually face nigh extinction. And it is of no coincidence that this development of technology, which is triggering the issues of the degradation of the planet's ecology, which, however you want to spell it, we're not treating the planet very nicely, and that's all we really need to say. But it's also things like it's pushing the nuclear arms race, which again, because of the development of hypersonic rockets, which have been developed to overcome missile defence systems, which again is part of what Rocket Lab's doing here in New Zealand, it reignited the nuclear arms race, and according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, we are now close to 100 seconds to midnight. Now, this is the theoretical point at which we face an extinction event. The clock's been running since 1947, and the 100 seconds to midnight is the closest that we have ever been. So all these developments in technology and all this rush forward and all these things that are actually going on, that's kind of the opposite direction. We're so wrapped up in technology and giving rights to technology that we haven't realized that we're ignoring the rights of nature, or the laws of nature, if you prefer, and it'll come back to bite us in the ass inevitably. AI, of course, is the element of the situation back to the issue of workforce. With AI, you don't need to negotiate them. So in that world of AI, you pretty much have a world of haves. Those are educated that can do the technical specialist jobs, and those that are just deemed basically expendable. And if you don't think that actually they have the very worst intentions for us, then you really haven't been a student of human history, because the reality is the oligarchs, and it doesn't matter where in the world or who they are or what their ideology is, left or right wing, actually the traditional story of history has been when they don't need to be nice to us, they are ultimately very brutal and to the point of they are murderous. The famous band Police, of course, do that wonderful track, which we'll actually go with in our second gap, which will be Murder by Numbers, ABC. But we've got a couple more minutes, so we'll just carry on. So, as I said, the point is with the Starlink we've got out there at Arrow Bay, is that's tracking the Starlink, which of course is said to as part of this militarisation of space. And as you start to look around New Zealand, it's there are 6 ground stations for the Starlink from the bottom of New Zealand to the tip of New Zealand, different, about 3 in the South Island, 3 in the North Island. You get facilities out in Central Otago which are to do with monitoring space shrapnel, which can also be used as equally to target for weapons targeting. You get into Christchurch, which is a hub of over 300 companies now set up, which are all in one way or another connected to the military industrial complex. Of course, you've got things like Dawn Aerospace tied up with Canterbury University, doing amazing flying up space planes in Oamaru, testing them up. Space planes can equally become bombers, and when you actually turn around and you look at the Dutch connections, of course, to Dawn Aerospace, they are very much tied into NATO. So again, there is a military industrial complex there. You go through, of course, you get into Wellington with the Ministry of Business Development. Everything's about business these days. It doesn't do anything about actually governing people for the sake of government. I mentioned Rocket Lab. You get into the universities, Canterbury University, Wellington University, Auckland University, huge space programs, heavily tied up with Five Eyes, heavily tied up with the intelligence apparatus. So again, the claim that the space industry is actually designed to benefit the planet and make for better societal improvements doesn't actually back it up when you actually look at who's doing the actual funding. I've actually counted up to this stage up to 27 different sites around New Zealand since basically we've Rocket Lab's turned up. Rocket Lab, of course, is in turn funded by Lockheed Martin, and it's also funded by I want to say, it's InQtel, which is a basically American CIA-owned company hedge fund that basically buys up technology to improve the American strategic purposes. Now, and of course, what does it use that for? Waging war. So let's again take a little bit of a break. And at this point, I'm going to back off. And I said, I promised you the police murdered by numbers, because this is what all this technology is. It's got nothing to do with climate change. It's got nothing to do with making a better society. It's all to do with basically war. And so on that point, we'll carry on with technology and hate laws in just a second. You're on the Deadline Report.